an ally. Glad you guys all made it out tonight. Let's see, we are already live on Facebook. So if you have the ability, if you have two screens or two devices, jump over to your Facebook page, go to the social justice advocacy page, share this onto your page, and your friends, family can see the good work that we are learning. Give them some influence. We got the link in the chat. Is that for the Facebook to share? Did we just make? Oh, that's the pack sheet. Okay. So yeah, go to the Facebook page, Social Justice Advocacy, share to your personal page. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Have I seen Michelle yet? Hey, there's Michelle.
Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to start with the welcome. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see your faces. Another week. I'm sure another 7 days of growth, another 7 days of understanding things you probably didn't previous, and we're excited to hear about it. Today we are going to be talking about, our outline. We're going to be doing breath work. I'm going to do a brief recap, very brief. Then we're going to be talking about voter disenfranchisement, the political silencing of the non-white, marginalized communities in the United States. And then we're going to be talking about some action items. We may or may not go into breakout rooms. We have some discussion questions that we want to unpackage. But depending on how many people show up, we might just have one big discussion just so that it's more robust and spend our time that way. But before we get too far along, obviously we want to ground ourselves, make sure that we are in the position that we need to be in to receive the call to accomplish the work that we've been called to accomplish. So Michelle, if you are ready, it's on you.
Hi, can you hear me good?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So thank you for having me. I'm so grateful to be here. A few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, when we talked about prana and mala. And remember, prana is anything that we do that gives us life and energy. And then mala is residue, toxins that we release from our body. And so something to keep in mind as we're breathing today, connecting with the multiple layers of ourselves, and see if you can look at the last week, what actions you have taken, what habits and what awareness you've had, and what has brought you more prana and more mala. Okay, so again, we do this with a level of observing and not with judgment. So this isn't meant to make you feel any shame or feel bad, but more so to assess what you're doing so that you can have a more holistic lens on your own wellness. All right, so wherever you are, go ahead and get comfortable, whether you're sitting down or standing up, it's up to you. And then close your eyes or stare down at a object in front of you with a soft gaze. You can rest your arms on your lap. We're going to start with our outer layer. So notice your physical body and where you are being supported right now, whether it's your couch or your chair or even the ground. Bring to the forefront of your mind that support that's underneath you, maybe even behind you. And then start to notice the temperature against your skin. Notice where your clothes and your skin meet. Maybe go a layer deeper. How are your muscles and your joints feeling? This our tendency to go directly to good, bad, and instead can you try to find some other descriptive language. Maybe you're feeling a little bit sticky, stuck. Maybe you're feeling supported. And then we'll go a layer deeper and to our energetic body. How's your breath? Your breath today? Last week we tapped into the sensation of sound and touch to observe our breath. You might do that right now. See if you can hear your breath. You don't necessarily need to change it. You might even notice that it starts to slow down automatically by watching. We'll go a layer deeper here. What thoughts are consuming you today? So on average, we think of the same thoughts on loop. So in this moment, what keeps coming up for you? And I want you to actually welcome any thoughts that come up for you. Again, we're simply observing. And in order to practice mindfulness, we can come back to our breath. We can come back to the sensation of touch in our physical layer. And then let's go a layer deeper and drop into your heart space and notice what are you feeling in your heart or possibly even in your gut region. And today I want you to see if you can acknowledge the duality of your emotions. So you could feel two things at once, even more than two things. And you might even join me with holding up your left and your right hand in front of you. And see if you can hold two emotions that are present for you in this moment, today, this week. And sometimes it's hard to tap into your emotions. And so if you find yourself going back to your headspace or back to your physical body, let's use our breath to interrupt. So you can inhale, interrupt the thought, and then exhale, drop in. We'll just spend another few breaths here. And maybe for you, you're still having a hard time identifying your emotions. So let this be a practice that you can come to every day. I challenge you to tap into this every single day, get curious. And you can categorize possibly your emotions as both shadows and light. So sometimes doing this work, this anti-racist, anti-oppression work, there's a lot of shadows and light as you're looking on media, social media, and the people around you. And so can you honor that space, holding both of these? You could bring your hands together and we'll finish with one big cleansing breath in. and out. Prana in, mala out. So let's empty all of our air out. And then big breath in and bigger breath out. And you can slowly blink your eyes open whenever you're ready. Wiggle it out. Roll your neck out. Maybe even shake out. Maybe even stand up. And thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Do you do house calls? We need to set you up on a house call retainer. Because I swear I've
Or
needed,
Zoom
like,
call retainer.
Huh?
A Zoom call retainer.
Zoom call? I don't know. I've needed you like a dozen times since last week.
I'm down. You got my phone number.
All right. Awesome. I got friends in high places. Let's put it that way. How about that? All right. So jump into a brief recap of just kind of what we were talking about. Obviously, the 4-part series is over, but we're kind of shifting into now how do we start to talk about and unpackage some of our potential solutions. And that might entail, the way we vote, research, how we educate the folks around us. It might entail going into our workspaces, expanding our workspaces and our advocacy in our workspaces, or it might entail doing some political advocacy itself. So the goal always in whatever we're talking about, the educational stuff, the data, the point is to give you a factual background to some of the things that you've probably heard to exist, but haven't been able to put a real finger on them. The point is to give those things contextualization so that you understand the practical impact, not through a historical lens or from a historical perspective, but how it is contemporary in its current dynamics and impacts. So I don't want to spend too much time on the recap, but I do want to make sure that we are always mindful that the goal of Operation Ally is to is to address a problem, right? And the problem that I think that we should be addressing or that we're looking to address is one, a lack of real education into not only the system, but how the system functions and how it pervades some of the things that it claims to provide in the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and some of the other founding documents, but also to make sure that those who are interested in making a change understand what changes should be made, why they should be made, and some of the historical context behind some of the problems in addressing those changes. That way we're not putting a Band-Aid over a bullet wound, okay? So we talked about the moralization and racialization of space. I'm gonna invite you to The Racial Contract by Dr. Mills. We talked about slavery, shifting to land discrimination, shifting to education, and how that ultimately impacts mass incarceration for a multiplicity of reasons. But ultimately, we find that is the fundamental breakdown of identity that becomes the root of the problem. The denial of a social identity through denial of access to space, land, economics, personhood, culture, etc. The denial of economic identity through the stripping of your wages and your labor. The denial of community identity by excluding you from various communities and then artificially defining and composing your community. And then the denial of the political identity, which we've talked about so far, and how space is manipulated through systems like gerrymandering to bifurcate and fragment various groups' political voices. But we're going to talk more about voter disenfranchisement tonight. So to jump into tonight's substance, like I said, we're going to be talking about voter disenfranchisement.
So let's take a look at the history of voting rights. And we all know that this is a long and traveled history. It's not as though America got it all right at the beginning. 1700 or 1776 rather, originally only land-owning men could vote in the United States, which meant that those in power continued to control all that was going to go forward in America. As we were establishing the country, only allowed to remain there. Move forward a little bit more than 60 years, and we're looking at the abolitionists and the suffrage movement begins to organize and come together at Seneca Falls. And then it's finally in 1856 that all white men are able to vote. So we see an establishment of male patriarchy right at the beginning of our country that continues. When the thing that I always like to point out when we're looking at this is see the threads throughout the timeline where it's continuous, and maybe it seems like, well, that's so far removed, but the original thread is where it all began. So we get out to 1868 before African Americans get granted citizenship, but still not yet the right to vote. So all of these only multiply and compound the issues surrounding the treatment of African Americans, minority communities, women, just essentially not rich white males who are the originating power in the United States. So, Thomas?
All right. So what's important about this time in history is what's called the Reconstruction era, right? Slavery was coming to an end. The 13th Amendment basically prohibits all indentured servitude and slavery, with the exception of those who are imprisoned. But that's what we've been talking about much with our mass incarceration analysis, right? So that was the 13th Amendment, but the 14th Amendment went much further. It actually gave due process rights, the right to life, liberty, and property, without due process of law. So the government can't take it without due process. Okay. And it also has what's called the equal protection laws, which meant that Black individuals should receive the same rights as all other individuals. There should be no difference categorically based on race. Interestingly enough, this was passed in 1868, and much of our timeline has taken place after 1868, right? So when we talk about the system as it has perpetuated itself, it really has illegally perpetuated itself. But we're going to talk about how some of these policies get carved out, where people are exempted out of the categorization of citizenship, or they're not classified as citizens, and therefore the rights and privileges or the immunities under the Constitution doesn't apply to them. And that's why citizenship is such a big issue, because it goes directly to political rights, to political power. And so what the 14th Amendment did is it basically stated any person born in the United States become a citizen of the United States. And that was its way of making sure that those slaves who were freed were guaranteed access to citizenship. But as we will continue to understand, that was not enough to make sure that Black individuals had a political voice. So it had to go further with the 15th Amendment.
Right. So in the 15th Amendment, you have legislature that allows for 15th Amendment prevents federal or state governments from denying the right to vote for citizens based on race. So now this is stripped away, but here's what's interesting. We strip away one law and we bring in another codification of rules that still disenfranchises a group of people. So if you look at the map off to the right, you see the map showing the spread of poll taxes. So even though we are in theory granting the right to vote to all people, we overlay another system on top of it that then disenfranchises, again, the poor and marginalized groups who wouldn't be able to afford the poll taxes. And these types of practices are the ones that have continued to hold down, all votes and help control votes towards those who already are in power. Now, when we look at other amendments, Susan B. Anthony, or other activity, we have Susan B. Anthony, Wyoming, finally in 1890, allowing women to vote. 19th Amendment gets passed, where all women have the right to vote, but not Native and Asian. So we still continue to hold the reins back on which groups have these rights to exercise their own representation, which is what America was supposed to be based on to begin with, is true representation for all people.
All right, and so, go ahead. Actually, Jason, why don't you take this slide?
Oh, okay. So continuing the timeline forward, as the fight for rights to vote continues to press on. Here's the thing that just shocks me, guys. We're way out of the 1700s. We're out of the 1800s. We're now, 1961 in the 23rd Amendment. DC residents have the right to vote for presidents, but not congressional representation. We still have issues that were moving forward. In 1965, the voting rights finally, in theory, removes discriminatory barriers that have kept many people of color from voting. And you think about all of the voting, get out the vote, rock the vote, all of the movements that we make and all of the cries that we make to get people out to exercise these rights. It's because of the fight that has so strongly been fought and for such a long time to allow it to happen. So, I'll just pass it off to you at that point, Thomas.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Fred, for the reminder on the 19th Amendment. Obviously, women's suffrage is a big deal. It goes to everything that we're talking about, the labels, the moralization, what rights should women have, etc., and then linking those labels to political voice. So the Voting Rights Act passed. Jason talked about the Voting Rights Act. These graphs actually show the impact of the Voting Rights Act on registration, both prior to the act and after. Okay, and you can see on the left side, the orange being where we were prior to the Voting Rights Act, and then the green in various states where they were after the Voting Rights Act. And you can see significant improvements. Look at Mississippi, where they look like they're around maybe 7, 8%, 6% on the side before the act. But then after the fact, you have 60% of individuals registered to vote, right? And so we're talking about big impacts that are being made as a result of this law, right? And if you look to the right, you're seeing that graph to the side, you're seeing the difference between Black individuals and white individuals that the Voting Rights Act had on these communities, right? You can see that on the left, the first graph, you see registration prior to the act. To the right is registration after the act. Well, the orange represents the Black community and the green represents the white community. Look at the variation in the position of the oranges compared to the left and the right, right? That difference is significant. Okay, so this is an indication that a Voting Rights Act wasn't just a symbolic act of legislation. It actually had an impact on getting folks registered and presumably voting. But if you also notice, there's not significant difference in the white, the green on that graph. Okay, so that tells you something. There's something in this act that goes to promote the previously disenfranchised voice in relation to an already franchised voice. So the question is, how does America respond to it? Well, America responds to it with Shelby V. Holder, right? Which is basically a lawsuit that occurred that said the Voting Rights Act, there's a section in it that states that if you had historically bad voter turnout, particularly based on minority voter turnout, in order to make any changes in your election policy, you had to get clearance from the Department of Justice, okay? And so it was Eric Holder, who was the attorney general at the time, was sued. And that law, that part, section 4B, was actually stricken because the Supreme Court claimed that it was outdated. There was no longer a need for the federal government to play such an instrumental part in local elections. And as we can see, it has only gotten worse. Okay, the voter disenfranchisement has gotten exacerbated. A good example of this is just what happened recently in the Kentucky primary, where you had people who lined up to vote, their votes were not counted. You had people who never got the opportunity to vote. People risked their lives in this COVID pandemic to vote and were turned away. And so some of the same voter disenfranchisement that we saw that made section 4B, I believe, 4B of the Voting Rights Act is still present to this day. Okay, so the Supreme Court basically said it's outdated, we don't no longer need it. They lifted the restriction, and then we start to see a flood of legislation where people start to put various restrictions on individuals' right to vote.
And here we see some graphs representing felony voter disenfranchisement. And the reality is here that it's just a pivot. It's a pivot to a new way to control people. And you look at, again, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia having 20% African-American felony disenfranchisement rate, where only 9 other states have at least 5% disenfranchisement rate. So certain particular areas taking extreme measures here, where we have people who are incarcerated, unable to cast a vote for the country that they still live in. And you may have a felony on your record, but that doesn't make you less of a citizen of the United States. And an individual is paying their time, doing their time, paying their debt to society. They still have a society that they're going to come out to live in, and should have a ability to have a voice within that society. So we need to look at all of the different ways voting has been suppressed, and not just say, oh, well, everybody has the right to vote now. That's not a reality in the way our system is currently set up.
Yeah, and actually one thing that I would say here is a lot of people say, well, actually, let me just go ahead. I'll talk on the next slide. So 48 states have laws that disallow people from voting from prison. 34 disallow people from voting when they're on felony, probation, or parole. And 12 states disallow individuals from voting with prior felony convictions. In California, you basically have to file to have your voting rights restored. How many people you think do that? It's a process, right? So one thing that we always talk about, and this is the other thing, it's like, well, but they did something wrong. Like they violated somebody. They took someone else's freedom or liberty, and therefore shouldn't have a voice. And what is the impact of giving somebody like that a voice? That is exactly why we are having the discussions that we're having. That is exactly why we took 4 weeks to break down the injustices in the system that leads to disproportionate representation in the prison system. Black men, 6% of the population, making up 40% of those incarcerated, makes absolutely no sense, right? 1 in 3 Black men expecting to be in prison or see incarceration, where 1 in 17 white men, makes no sense. Okay, and so when we're talking about the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the fact that all groups are supposed to be equally situated, we should see more parity. We should see more consistency in the numbers, especially considering statistically both groups commit about the same crime at the same rate, right? Drug crimes, overrepresentation in the Black community, underrepresentation in the white community as far as incarceration is concerned. Yet statistically, you get about the same rate of illicit drugs. So there should be more consistency between those ratings. So when you're starting to talk about, well, no, they don't deserve a voice, they should do this, they, that, they, you're literally talking disproportionately about a group of people being denied access to their right to vote. And that again goes into the labels, why people find themselves the way they are, the policies, right? We are a blame people system as opposed to a blame policy system. And then that results in us turning around and then stripping them of their political voice because of some stereotype that we've assigned to that particular label. So this has dire consequences when we talk about political representation and what it means to be a society that is open for all races.
Yeah, and before I go into this slide too much, one of the things I wanted to just dovetail off of that is the then almost self-fulfilling prophecy within a community. Because when your voice has historically been shunned and shuttered and taken and rights stripped away, layers laid on top of to prevent you from voting, then people begin to get the belief my vote doesn't matter anyways. They're going to find a way to discount my vote anyways. Like Thomas said, people stand in line for hours and hours to vote, and it doesn't even happen. So then you have these confirmations within the community that ultimately this company or this country doesn't want to hear my voice, and no matter what I do, exercising my voice is going to be an exercise in futility. And that's conversation to be had within the community to reshape and restructure that thought process. But at the same time, it's very difficult to reshape that thought process when it's consistently being reinforced with rules such as this, or results such as this. You look at the fact that 3 in 10 Black men can expect to be disenfranchised at some point in their lifetime. And when you look at the voter representation, 1 in 13 Black voters are 1 in 13 disenfranchised versus non-Black voters 1 in 56. So we have a system that a criminal justice system that disproportionately impacts the lives of the Black community, and then that becomes the new Black. That criminal becomes the new Black. So the language is shifted. It feels more correct that, hey, criminals are criminals and we don't have to treat them the same as everybody else. I think 13th does a great job of weaving that language through of how you go from someone being a slave to someone being convict lease to someone now they're a criminal, and now we can brand them as a super predator, and we can continue to strip away rights from the same community simply by calling it something different. So all of these things are just compounding effects upon one another.
Yeah, and you add to the fact that we Black individuals are more likely to be imprisoned and more likely to suffer longer prison sentences, then you start to understand why this disenfranchisement rate works the way that it does. But incarceration isn't the only way that we disenfranchise. We also disenfranchise based on voter ID laws, okay? And here's a graph. 1 in 10 Americans don't have identification, as opposed to 1 in 4 Americans, right? We're talking about 10% of all voters are disenfranchised based on voter IDs. 25% of all African Americans are disenfranchised based on voter IDs. You look at the fact that low income voters are mostly impacted. 15% of individuals who make $35,000 or less per year are without a government issued identification. Okay, so not only does incarceration matter when it comes to the political voice, but economic power matter, right? And this links back to the recap that we talked about earlier, the fact that the Black community has been systemically and historically denied access to a political voice. And then we turn around and link politics and economics, then it makes sense that you have a group that is disproportionately impacted. And it just so happens that that group disproportionately is poor and disproportionately more incarcerated and in prison.
We've got a little bit of background noise. If you could find the mute button, that'd be great. Again, adults without an ID, 25% of those adults are Black. You see the rest of the statistics going down, Asian, Latino, all of these minority groups fit into the very beginning of this. And you'd say like, well, hey, why don't we make solving the problem? Because voter ID sounds it sounds like such a simple, everybody should agree on this. There's one way to do this. Why don't we just get everybody IDs, and we can, run a campaign to go out into the communities and help those communities get government issued IDs. Well, again, you come back to the realities of the cultural definitions or cultural mores that have been created around the disenfranchisement of the Black community, where many Blacks don't want to have a government issued ID because they don't want to be tracked, or there's fear within the family based on history. And it's not unregarded fear, it's based on things that have actually happened. And unrelated to the voter issue, but related to the feeling issue, is that you look at currently, I just read a statistic this morning that they're having a hard time finding Black participants for a vaccine study. And I just began laughing because I know why Black participants don't want to participate in a government-sanctioned, study to study the effects of a new drug. Has anybody heard of the Tuskegee experiments? People don't want to put themselves back under these control systems. And so some of these issues are continuing to be perpetuated from the way the community has been treated by the government to begin with. So it's more convoluted than people think. Oh, that's just a clear-cut issue. Everybody should have an ID, and if they don't, just get one. Well, that's coming from your background and what you've understood growing up in your household. And no one's ever had the issues that's been held within the Black community for decades and generations.
How pervasive is the problem, right? This graph actually, I think, does a pretty good job of talking about something that we can do. Voter registration drives. We probably never think about the social value that those have on various communities. But as this graph shows, you see that more African-American and Latino voters are impacted based on the voter registration drives. You see 11.1% of Black voters come from voter registration drives, compared to 5.4% in the white community. So when you think about the impact that voter registration drives have on increasing participation, the question is, why don't we have more of them? Well, we're not headed in that direction. What we're actually seeing is the reversal. We're seeing states make ending popular days, right, and same-day registration to make it easier to vote, right? They limit voter registration drives, even though they impact Black and Latino voters to a higher rate, and they reduce various impact and resources that goes toward registering people to vote. And the graph here on the right actually shows all of the states that have put in place some sort of restriction on the right to vote. Okay, so there's an impact that these restrictions have on voter participation and voter turnout. And one thing that is to note, I don't know if you're reading Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, but he actually talks about the fact that we're always blaming the Black community for not participating in voting or not exercising their right to vote. And he has a chapter where he really goes in deeply in his disappointment in the system, because Black individuals were attempting to exercise their right to vote, but many of the votes were spoiled, or they were not counted for many reasons, or they were just disallowed access to the vote itself. And so when we talk about voter registration drives, it seems like a small thing to do, but it has a bigger impact on the people who need that impact the most. But it's also a systemic thing that also needs to be addressed on a deeper level.
Yeah, and this slide doesn't need a whole lot of explanation to it. I mean, in 2016, 9.5 American adults, most of whom were people of color, lacked voting rights. And, you know, we are a country that prides itself, that holds itself out on being a country where people have representation. They have the opportunity to, you know, to have a self-determined future, that they can impact the shaping of the country. And yet we see disenfranchisement throughout several different arenas that largely impacts people of color. So how do we work to balance this and give strength to all people to be properly represented within a country that is built on being a democratic republic?
So here, basically, representation means humanity. And really the reason why is, as humans, we all have interests. We all have things that we need in order to survive. And politics is defined as who gets what when, right? So we're principally determined, or we're principally concerned with how resources are allocated and distributed based on those interests, okay? And so when you're talking about the interests that we have as humans, we're literally talking about the political system that we have in place for the distribution and allocation of resources that meet those interests. And that's why ultimately political representation is a human right. Okay, having a say in how your interests are regarded becomes one of the most fundamental reasons why you see people put their lives on the line day in and day out to fight for freedom. Throughout the slave trade, throughout slavery, there are always revolts. People lost their lives all the time running away, resisting, because it's innate in our human construct to fight for our interests. And when we're talking about fighting for our interests, we're talking about fighting for a political voice. So the question then becomes, when does the state have a right to take away that human right, and who gets to speak up on behalf of those who cannot speak? All right. And so one of the things that I would posit to this group is we know that voter disenfranchisement exists. And we know that you can link it directly to slavery. We can link it directly to redlining. We can link it directly to racial restrictive covenants that resulted in disproportionate poverty. And then we can see that that disproportionate poverty links to disproportionate homelessness. Statistically, most people who find themselves in jail, most arrests that are made by people who are without a home. Okay, so we're still talking about racial disparities in almost every aspect of our system and how it disproportionately impacts the Black community. Now we're talking about the voice that the Black community has in speaking up for itself on a policy level, and speaking up for itself and getting change and getting its interests represented on a political level. But we're also representing or seeing that we are disproportionately impacted by denial of representation. And so allyship means also not just, reading, educating, moving in the spaces that we have been, but it also means you understanding the system, understanding how the system denies people a voice, and then voting in a way that reinforces those people's right to represent themselves, okay? Allyship is not ever about reinforcing your ability to speak up on behalf of somebody else. Allyship is always linked to your seeking to empower an individual to speak up on their own behalf. Self-determination is what all of this is ultimately about. But voter disenfranchisement, political disenfranchisement, and political silencing erodes that direct connection. And so as allies and as individuals who are equipped with the right to vote, I think we owe a duty to the ultimate system to keep it true to what it promises to all people, and that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of property without and not have those rights stripped without due process of law. And so we also talk about how representation means. What does it mean? right? In California, we are a republic and a democracy. A republic means we don't vote on issues, we vote on people who then go vote on those issues. But in California, we're also a democracy in other states that have a referenda system or a proposition system where if you get enough signatures, you can put issues on the ballot to have voted on, right? The death penalty, it barely failed having it recalled. I think it was 53% voted to keep it, right? The slavery, the loophole that exists, that's something that can be amended by popular vote in California. We have two different systems, a delegate versus trustee system. A delegate is somebody that you sends to just vote on the will of the people. And a trustee is somebody who goes and they represent the people in the best way that they know how, independent of the will of the people. Okay, so these are people who speak up on behalf of the people that they're representing, and they may or may not fall in line with the will of the people that they're representing. But what makes this important to this particular discussion is that most of our representation happens through other people. Okay, so the thought that, oh, we're going to have felons now running our laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many mechanisms that prevent people from changing state law and amending the Constitution that is not going to happen. You're going to have an overwhelming, disproportionate presence of criminals in order to have that particular impact. And if you get to the point where you have that greater representation of criminals in your society, then I think the question is better asked, what are you doing to make these criminals, as opposed to what are these people doing to become criminals?
And I would add to that and kind of amplify exactly what you just said there at the end, Thomas, that let's remember, even when we think of, oh, well, you're going to have these felons run the system. How did we determine that these people, that a group of people are felons? The justice system, we've seen the cracks within it that are so disproportionately facing one community. And we just need to acknowledge that whenever we're talking about, oh, well, people who've committed a crime, we should be able to treat them X, Y, and Z. But first of all, we know that all crime isn't discovered or solved, and the proper person being punished for the crime. We also know that even when the proper person is brought before the judge and they're convicted guilty, the crime sentences are disproportionate to one side versus the other. The lengths of time, all of it continues to slide down one side of the table. So when we're speaking about crime, we end up almost inherently speaking about a community and being minorities, people of color, that are being looked at as the criminals and the criminal element, despite the fact, as Thomas has already said multiple times, crime is committed at roughly the same rate statistically.
Well, and there's the big whopper, Jason, in my thinking, right? If you disallow people the right to determine the laws that determine what crimes are, and then you disproportionately arrest them for crimes that they have no say in, then the question then becomes, how free are those people, right? How much freedom and liberty have they actually gained? And when we're looking at the 14th Amendment that says equal protection, all groups should have equal protection under the laws, the question then becomes, why is that closed loop working so tightly in the Black community as opposed to other communities? So, I mean, we're in election year. It's tough, right? And I think some of the questions, we have to discuss is, does your vote matter, right? I see people asking that. Does it matter? And if so, how? How does it matter? Are you able to accomplish the right outcome when you don't understand the system that you're voting in, right? An example of this is Proposition 31 and Proposition 33 a few years back. It's my favorite example, but it's probably quite old by now. I'm sure there are others where Proposition 31 and Proposition 33 directly contradicted each other, but both of them passed. Okay, they both received more than 50% of the vote, which means a good group voted for both of them. and that is an indication that they didn't understand what they were voting for. And so if you're voting, it's not enough just to vote, especially from a position of an ally where you're talking about having to vote and fill in voices for people who are voiceless, right? You have to go the extra step and kind of understand more of the system you're voting in and the implications of those policies, right? Galea in the book Well that we've been asking you to read talks about compassionate policies, right? Getting to the body politic to a position to act out compassion on a policy level. Ibram Kendi talks about anti-racist policies, policies that are intent on closing the equity gap between racial groups. Okay, that is what allyship is on the political level. It is dismantling the systems that deny people a voice, but it's also making sure you are understanding and equipped to understand the system and how it functions and how you might be able to vote best in that system. This is the question I have. Who truly understands the system, right? And I think that's a big part of our problem. I think that's why people are asking the question, does my vote matter? Because I mean, you can study this stuff for years. I'm a testament to that. I've been studying literally for years. And there are so many intricacies, so many enclaves, and so many things that are pitfalls in the system that people just don't understand. And even as a lawyer, even as a political scientist, even as somebody who's devoted my life to studying the system, there's still much to learn and much to unravel there.
Thomas, we just had a question come in. There's actually been a couple of questions through the chat that we hadn't resolved, and I'd like to take a minute. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, I feel like. So if we just take the one that came in most recently.
Just so I can close the loop on this, sorry, that's the way my brain works. Is the system too fragmented for our vote to matter? Okay, those are the questions. Okay, I'm sorry, I had to close that out.
No, sorry, I thought it was the last one already.
You know me, bro, I got too many questions.
Yeah.
All right,
so kind of right in dovetail of what you just said, Crystal asked a question regarding the Electoral College. I have questions about its origins and why we cannot change it. Since it was enacted when the slaves were 3/5 of a person, is there a way to make it actually equal now, or does it actually adjust with time? So the question is surrounding the Electoral College, its current, the way it currently works to continue, how it's tied back to slavery, and if it's adjusted over time.
No, it has not been adjusted over time. Basically, the states were given proportionate representation by representatives, and those representatives are the people who elect the president, right? So the goal is to, and this is where we get back to the system. The system is fragmented in such a way that the president is not elected by popular vote. He's elected by electors who are elected by popular vote, right? So we basically take the seat of the president and we stretch it one more degree of separation from the people. And the reason that exists is to make sure that the interest of those who are in power are able to be maintained, or is able to be maintained, since electors are not required to follow the popular vote of their states. And so that is something that most people want it gone, because there's absolutely no reason for it. Donald Trump wouldn't be president if there wasn't an electoral college, right? And that in and of itself kind of tells you why an electoral college exists. Donald Trump's base, the popular base, right? The folks that we like to claim are racist, et cetera, that's one group. But he has another group that support him. And those people aren't, I'm not going to say that they're racist or anything like that. They vote based on their interests, right? And quite honestly, if you know politics, most of the rhetoric, most of the language that gets thrown around has no political value. It's political posturing, but it does impact the way that people's attitudes change toward each other, obviously, as we've seen an increase in racial incidents. But the point I'm making is You have people that have elected Trump for the simple fact that he's good for the rich, right? They have economic interests and they're voting based on that economic interest. They don't care about the language. They don't care about the grandstanding. They don't care about the posturing. They simply care about the tax breaks. And T.I., actually, a black rapper, talked about it. He's very, very, very good for the rich, right? And so you have those interests that gets to be played out and solidified through the practices of the electoral college. So you don't end up with somebody that is popular among everybody, but somebody who's popular among the wealthy.
And I would also say other people vote along their interest that may be moral interest, that they're one or two issue voters, that I'm never going to vote for somebody who supports this policy. And, whether that be, abortion or LGBT rights, if somebody supports that, there are individuals who say, I'm never going to vote for somebody who supports that because it goes against their morals. But again, going back to the original base of the question, the Electoral College, I'd like to tease that out a bit from a conversational standpoint, because this is, especially as we come up to over the next, what are we in August now? So the next 3 months, going to be coming up more and more in people's minds is my vote actually going to matter? And I've said since prior to this last election that, hey, if you're a Republican in California, your presidential vote, it doesn't count. It quite literally is not going to count. We know that California leans far left. It's going, all of the Electoral College votes in California are going to go to the Democratic candidate. That's just the way the system works. How do we purport to be a system that allows people equal representation? So some of the things that I've heard when I have this conversation with people is, well, if we didn't have the Electoral College, the biggest states or the most populous states, the most populated states would just control everything that is happening. And that's where the system, at least in its cleanest face value, was presented to be what it was presented to protect. That, because when we started the election process, states were so single-minded because so much of our economy was driven by only what was happening within that state. And an agricultural economy would only vote for people and policies that will perpetuate agricultural values and economic strength. Where in the North, you would have people who are more on the mercantile, textile phases of industry that would only vote for that direction. So the Electoral College was meant to levelize the states' influence that they could have, based on most of the state would likely have the same type of leanings and feelings. Well, we know in today's world, states, on my block, we've got, as many adamant Republicans as we do adamant Democrats. The unity in states is not nearly the same as it was when the Electoral College was created. Thomas, what are some of your thoughts and arguments around the fact that people will say, oh, well, we would just have the big popular states are the only ones that would be that the political candidates would even bother going to, because you just have to win California, New York, Florida, Texas, and there you go, you're gonna win the presidency.
Well, I don't think that that's completely true, but as Julianne pointed out, the number of electors is linked to the population, right? So California and New York still have the lion's share of the electors. But the issue then becomes, if California, I think it's like 56 million or however many million voters are in California, are voting in an election, instead of all of the electors going Democrat, maybe 57% or 53% of California would go Democrat, where the other 40-something% would go Republican, right? We'd see much more sharing of that, of those vote, right? People talk about California as if it's a monolith, and it's not, right?
Yeah.
Like there are Republicans here, there are Republicans in New York, and both of them would be vastly represented in a popular situation. That's how I would respond to that.
And one of the things that I've heard is, well, the political campaigning is so heavy in all of these flyover states, the Midwest, because their voices matter because of the Electoral College. They actually can have an impact. But I think COVID is going to show even a greater argument for the dissolution of the Electoral College, because how is campaigning happening now? There is no campaign trail. Campaign trail is Zoom, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Like that's where the campaigning is happening. It's not face to face, body to body anymore. And by and large, that's where much of the impact was happening to begin with. That people were being moved online. Information is no longer limited to where somebody is physically located. Even if there was an election, or not an election, even if there is a Trump rally in Oklahoma, guess what? It's broadcast to all states and all across the country, where when the Electoral College was originally created, if there was a rally in Oklahoma, only people in Oklahoma and maybe a couple of neighboring states are ever going to hear that message. That's no longer the case. Messaging can be delivered all throughout the country in an instant. It can be delivered from your bed with a tweet. So the existence and the defense over the Electoral College as this brilliant way to levelize all states' influence, many of the arguments for it are just quite honestly antiquated. We've grown past it, and people who say, well, it's written into our Constitution, therefore it must remain. Well, we've amended the Constitution before. That was part of the process of building it.
Well, absolutely. We got actually well, first I want Julianne, one thing I want to mention is the link to population in the electorate. Even this goes back really to our discussion earlier on disenfranchisement, right? Because if you're not able to vote, then you're also not able to elect the elector, right? So all of this goes into playing the same game where we're seeking to disenfranchise folks and minimize their voice on different levels, and this is one of them. We got a question on Facebook. What are some ideas on campaign finance and gerrymandering overhaul? And let's open up the discussion. Folks, if you have something to chime in, let's talk. But this question basically goes to where we've been talking about how the system denies people from accessing their vote, right? But we haven't talked too much about how the system is created to basically pre-select the slate of candidates that you're going to be able to vote for based on gerrymandering rules and campaign finance positions. And I understand that people have pretty strong positions on those. So what are some thoughts on campaign finance and gerrymandering laws? I think just one, getting rid of private funding and campaigns, I think is just a simple solution. I think campaigns and elections should be political. Well, they are, but I think they should be like inherently political activities where the government foots the bill. And there's a level of equality where everybody has access to be heard and to be a candidate. But what are some of the thoughts? What are some thoughts to the discussion questions that we have up?
Well, Thomas, while we're waiting for maybe some people to type in the different chat areas, whether that be Facebook or in the Zoom, I have a question that doesn't require a lot of thought, but I'm looking at your, and this is a little bit humorous, I'm looking at your background. Is that the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air living room?
It certainly is.
I knew I recognized it. I was like, wait a minute, Will stood right there when he was mad at his dad. I remember this scene. You trying to sit up there like Uncle Phil.
I got the idea from Brittany. She was in a meeting with somebody who did it, and it was absolutely genius. So I'm like, I have to steal it.
Yeah. So maybe another question can be, if Thomas and I were both in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which characters would we?
I don't even want to hear that. I already know what we're going to say. We're moving on. Moving on. I will not be called Carlton during this. Karina asks, is it feasible to mount a campaign to eliminate the Electoral College right now? And what would that look like? I mean, I think now is probably, it's so hard. My heart wants to say, yeah, like everybody's pissed off right now. Everybody is wondering what the heck is going on with the politics. You have people on both sides of the political spectrum that are disenchanted with the political system right now. But at the same time, I think because of how contentious this presidential election is, I do think that there's probably a side that thinks that the Electoral College is their way to keep or gain power, whatever side you want to put that, you want to attribute with that form of thinking. I think that might be an issue where now more than ever, we might see a stronger push for it, but we might even see a stronger opposition to it because you know how the popular is leaning.
Yeah, I think you're right, Thomas. I went to the exact same place in my mind. The environment is there, but this particular voting season is too emotionally charged for the energy to be directed towards it properly. If a campaign was going to be mounted to eliminate the Electoral College, it needs to be, I would think, immediately following this election cycle, so that it's allowed to have the space that it needs to, because right now everything is going to be consumed by this particular presidential election cycle.
Heck, look at voting by mail, right? I never thought that would be as contentious as it is now, but it's become a real hot button issue. Yeah, I mean, well, so Brian, we're answering two different questions. Brian, I think you're answering the feasibility of success. I was answering the feasibility of a campaign. Like, what would a campaign even look like during this time? And I don't like it. Not that I don't like the campaign, because I would support a campaign. I don't like the way it would be received and manipulated.
Yeah. It would almost be like you'd put it on the ballot for this year to get attention to it for the next time. That'd be the only thing. Yep, you're right, Brian. It would have to be people would have to be convinced that all sides would help them, which, as an individual, I don't see how you could not believe that having your vote directly impact the outcome. I mean, let's face it, we call the California electorate with like 6% of the vote accounted for, because we see a trend. We know the trend is not going to change based on, the counties and the cities' voting history. And they just say, all right, 7% of people have voted, call it's going that direction. Like, how is that not self-defeating? I felt that way since I was like 16 years old watching an election. Like, that doesn't make sense. How can you say that this person's going to win? There's only 4% of the vote calculated. But that's what we do.
Yeah, that's the way statistics work. I actually, Bill and or Linda asked, I think, a really good question. Are there groups that vet propositions that assess the impact on people of color? And there, I mean, there's a woman that I consider her a mentor, a guide, oracle, everything, Amber Rose. She works for an organization that actually works to put together these propositions and to advocate for them. But I don't know if there's a group that say go through all of the propositions and actually rates them. And that actually may be a pretty, that's actually a pretty cool idea if somebody were to take these propositions and actually assess them based on their impact, their ability to close the equity gap. What happened?
SJAP should do that. You just got a homework assignment.
Yeah, I know SJAP should do it, but I'm gonna take that as a volunteer. Julianne just volunteered to spearhead that project. But yeah, I think that is something that we could talk about providing for people, because if we can set up a mechanism for assessing propositions and their impact on minority communities, then I think that's something that can be diffused throughout the country at various levels to do that assessment. I think that's a really good idea. All right. Anybody have comments? Right. Let's talk. Jason, you talked about the fact that you didn't believe that your vote mattered because they start to call the presidential election prior to. Oh, that voter guide is no good. Like, quite honestly, those voter guides are so half baked, and that's how you end up with people that are voting for the same thing, because they don't go in enough detail, don't give any context or background. But we can definitely make our own. And even if it's more interactive, because I know most people aren't going to read all that. But yeah, I think that is something that we should do. Oh, they're saying, why y'all keep trying to volunteer me for stuff? Juliette has already volunteered for the project. There was something I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, you talked about feeling discouraged because they call elections so early. And actually, Kendi talked about the Bush versus Gore thing, how, they went to sleep thinking one person won, and then they woke up thinking another thing just because of that early call. But that is, I want to take a second to unpackage that, because I think a lot of people get stuck there. A lot of people get stuck on the fact that because I don't see my direct impact on the president, my vote doesn't matter, right? And not this election, but the last election here in Laverne, the mayoral race literally came down to 7 votes, right? So a 8-vote swing would have meant that we had a completely different mayor for 2 years, right? Tell me that your vote doesn't matter, right? Like, we have parties with more than 8 people that if we bring them together and say, hey y'all, let's go sip on some wine and go vote, right?
We could even have a COVID party with 8 people. As long as it's under 10, we wouldn't be in trouble.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, you can bring together a group of people and literally decide who's the city's next mayor, right? Or some of these propositions that barely pass 51, 52%. We're talking about a few thousand people deciding to say, okay, we're going to do this a particular way. We're going to have a concerted effort, make sure our friends are speaking this particular way. So your vote actually does matter. And it matters in a lot more profound way than we think, because the president of the United States, I mean, Donald Trump has a lot of power, but his power is more soft, right? Presidents have soft power. They have influential power, right? The president of the United States doesn't sign the ordinances that impact the police department, right? They don't sign the ordinances that impact our schools. They're not controlling our school district or our police forces or our parks and recreation, the stuff that literally impact us on a daily basis. And it just so happens that the system is constructed in a way that anything the president does, right, can be undone by either Congress or the Supreme Court, right? So we need to be thinking
governors
about,
who act in defiance.
Excuse me?
Or governors who choose to act in defiance out of the best interest of their state.
Right? Interposition and nullification, it happens, right? So when we're thinking about the president and that becomes where we stop, that means we're falling short of giving politics the real value that it plays in our lives and impact us on a daily basis.
And no, I totally agree with you in that regard. And specifically, comment and my sentiment is about the presidential election, which when you look at that sentiment, we also know that it is by and large the presidential election that drives people to the polls. And it's not a matter of should it be that way. It is that way. If people feel disinterested about the president, whether or not they are going to have an impact on the president, they don't show up to the polls. When people get there, many of them are currently disinterested in the down the ballot issues, and they decide literally standing in line or standing at the booth as they read through it, and they check a box or not. So I think the disenfranchisement, even if we isolate it to, yeah, that's true at the presidential level, but it's not true at the state and local level, which do have a greater life. People's own reality is that they're driven to the polls by and large by what's happening at the presidential level. And I would say probably at the state level when you have your governors up for term as well. But it's just the downward impact.
That's true. And so part of our system has to be correcting that, getting people to look down ballot on more of the things that matter. But it is the presidential elections that bring people out. There's a great example that was given on Facebook. Give everybody $100 credit, right? And then you can just use your credit toward the candidate that you want. And in that case, well, now you're chasing those hundreds, right? As opposed to he noted 60,000 people maxed out their campaign contribution, which is only 0.02% of the population. So you have a few dinners with people who are willing to write big checks, and you've now made up the voice of millions, right? And so the way to take that away is you equalize everybody's ability to financially contribute as well as their political voice, i.e. democracy, one person, one vote. Bill and Linda raises the point of the impact that mail-in ballots will have on voter suppression. I'm not sure if you're asking if mail-in ballots will lead to greater suppression or will lead to greater policies that will result in suppression. I mean, my thinking is like it's mail-in. You would think that it would increase people's participation. But that is me just thinking ideally, I guess, because quite honestly, I get a mail-in ballot every year and forget to mail it in. The last few elections, I've always selected to vote by mail and always have gone to do it in line because I never mail in my mail-in ballot. So,
however, though,
Julianne says the same.
Yeah, me too. The issue becomes the timing with that again. People mail in their ballots, but you hear consistently over and over again that the election is called, mail-in ballots have not yet been counted. And so that's one place where I have some concern about it, but I do think if they were all accounted for properly, they could be, it would be an improvement to the representation issue, because those who can't take the time to go to the polls could have their representation done through the mail-in manner. It's a matter of, do they get it mailed in time that it actually gets counted before the decision is made?
Yeah, one thing that 4 or 5 years ago, we put out a 15-point platform. The thrust of it was making voting easier. One of a few things that we had on there was, one, at 18, automatically to register to vote. You get the day off for the holiday, or you get the day off to vote. It's a paid holiday. And when you are incarcerated, either you don't lose your right to vote, or once your debt is paid, it's immediately restored. No need to file anything. These are just a few things. And we showed the slide of just how voter registration drives impact the Black and Latino community. The Voting Rights Act impacts the Black and Latino community. These things are going to impact and greater the voice of the Black and Latino community. So the proof is in the pudding, right? We have the statistical data that supports such policies are only going to increase the vote and the voice. But again, our political structure is set up in such an oligarchical way where it is meant to serve the interests of that very, very, very wealthy percent at the top, right? And you have a vast majority, like I believe it's like 0.1% has the wealth of like the bottom 50%. It's something gross like that, right? So that disparity, that income stratification means that there's an interest in making sure that the vote at the people who are not economically performing better are stifled because there are more of us. Any other thoughts or questions, comments? Karina, a recent study with some flaws seems to show that mail-in voting modestly increases turnout, but doesn't significantly affect partisan balance of the vote. We find that universal vote by mail does not appear to affect either party's share of the turnout. Universal vote by mail does not appear to increase either party's vote share. And 3, universal vote by mail modestly increases overall average turnout rates. So basically, you see the number of participants rising, but you don't see any party getting a greater share of those participants, which is interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It would be, however, when you contextualize it to our COVID environment, where the issues surrounding COVID have disproportionately impacted the Black and brown communities, it could provide a safety net for those communities to continue to have representation.
Yeah, and we're coming up on 7 o'clock. So I do think that going through, especially with November coming up here soon, and this being such a big year, I think we're going to have much more turnout. A point was made that we have a lot of new voters now who want to be given direction. They want to know how to use that political voice. I think it actually will be worth, everybody's time, all of the volunteers to get together and do this, put together an assessment that goes through and systematically weighs the impact that each proposition, each candidate, et cetera, will have on people of color. Chase in the link shared in the chat shared a link with a timeline of voter disenfranchisement. That is something that we are going to capture and make sure it gets added to our Facebook. Yes. Fred, we have the volunteer for the proposition. Julianne volunteered twice. Everybody who I'm saving this chat. So anybody who has volunteered me to do it are automatically listed as volunteers since I'm helping. How about that? All right. That being said, let's go ahead. Jason, if you have any closing thoughts, why don't you share those and we can call it a night.
Just in closing, I would just continue to say, as we gather together here week after week, it's only as powerful as your weekly activity with it. We know that there's a lot of information that we throw at you guys, and that's on purpose because there's a lot of opportunity out there for you to act on it. And wherever you find yourself jumping into or being confronted with a situation, if there's something that comes at you and you're like, oh man, I wish I had a good response to this, we have the Operation Ally group for you to throw out questions and have concerns raised and maybe answered by your peers. Maybe if Thomas and I have the opportunity to jump in there throughout the week, that is certainly something that we do look at as well. So yeah, I would just say continue not to be learners, but to be implementers. The crux, the difference between knowledge and wisdom is wisdom applies the knowledge that it receives. So continue to move out in wisdom.
Thank you. Well, and I do want to say, you mentioned the Facebook. We have been, especially Jason and I have been less participatory on that page. Obviously, Jason has a baby and is in the full swing of work and all that stuff. But remember, we still have a lot of those projects going, right? Diverse SGV is taking up quite a bit of time working on that cross-cultural roundtable, and we're still doing presentations and stuff like that. So just because we're not as active on social media really is an indication that we've become probably 10 or 20 times more active out in the community in the Zoom world. So do continue to engage. We love to see the engagement, and it's a community, right? And that community has value in and of itself without neither Jason nor I. So we thank you to folks who continue to participate.
Thomas, for those who hadn't received the opportunity, you talked about me being a new father. I just sent you and Brittany a message with one of you want to throw it up there for a screen share, since I don't have the ability to screen share.
Well, let me give you the ability to screen share, my man.
Yeah.
How did you send it to me?
Zoom.
Oh yeah, I didn't see it.
Or not Zoom, Messenger. It's in your Messenger.
All right, we're going to go ahead and kill our Facebook feed. Thank you guys for folks who watched, for the folks who participated. Unfortunately, I only saw one thread. I don't know if there were any other comments or questions. But thank you. You guys have a good night and be safe.